3,000 casualties by the end of 1966 and 400,000 combat troops on the ground in Vietnam. By the end of 1967, 500,000 combat troops in Vietnam. American casualties, approximately 100,000 killed or wounded by the end of 67. What's that? Well, I haven't quite got to that yet. Yeah, that doesn't even count that. So, when did American troops in Vietnam peak? When did we have the most American troops in Vietnam? May 1st, 1969. 543,482. That was the highest number of American troops that were committed to Vietnam. That occurred on May 1st of 1969. 543,482. 543,482. Now, are all of those probably facing enemy fire on a daily basis? They have different jobs. But I will tell you that half were. Half of that 543,482 faced hostile enemy fire daily. Half. What did Lyndon Johnson say, Maddie, in 1964? Well, I mean, in essence, he wasn't going to do what? Send troops. By the end, by May 1st of 69, he's got more than 500,000 there. And half of them are facing conflict every day. So what happened by the end, actually it happened before 69, what happened by the end of 67 in our country, when we had nearly 500,000 in there and 100,000 casualties? What happened for the first time in the history of our country? What? People began to protest. People, and why? Why did they do that? Mainly because it was a televised war, and they knew what was going on. So by the end of 1967, not 69 when we had the most troops in, by the end of 1967, it was the first time that American citizens began to question our commitment to Vietnam. Had that ever happened in a war before? People never questioned what we were doing in World War I or World War II or Korea. People supported our soldiers. They thought we were doing right. Now that's going to take us to another subtopic, and after I give you this information, you'll understand why people were protesting. 1967, a tough year for the United States in Vietnam. And you'll understand maybe why people were upset. And I'm going to give you 6 reasons why it was a tough year, and 6 reasons why people began to protest after the end of 1967. So 1967, a tough year in Vietnam for the United States. And I'm going to give you 6 reasons why it was tough. All 6 of these reasons leading to people starting to protest. Number 1, by the end of 1967, more than 14,000 American soldiers had been killed. By the end of 1967, more than 14,000 American soldiers had been killed in Vietnam. By the end of 1967, number 2, more than 92,000 American GIs had been injured or wounded, had been wounded. Number 3, the financial cost to the United States to fight in this war was staggering. By the end of 1967, it was costing the United States $1 million a day to fight this war. $1 million a day. So all of a sudden people became aware of what we were spending. $1 million a day to fight the Vietnam War by the end of 1967. What else were people concerned about as far as the war goes? Short. How long the war was going on. By the end of 1967, there was only one war in American history that had lasted longer. Anybody know which one it was? The American Revolution, that's right. So it became the second longest war in American history. And there was no end in sight. It wasn't like we were about to be done. So that was the fourth reason why it was a tough year. The Vietnam War had become the second longest in American history, second only to the Revolutionary War. Okay, get up. I'm going to watch the nightly news. This is the next reason. I'm going to watch the nightly news tonight. 90% of the coverage during that 1 hour was on what? The Vietnam War. 90% of the television coverage by the end of 1967 covered the war, and they estimated that over 50 million Americans were tuning in nightly. So was the word getting out? Absolutely. So that's number 5. 90% of the television news. If you watch the nightly news for 1 hour tonight, back in 1967, 90% of the news would be about the Vietnam War, and 50 million people were watching. Now, the sixth problem is what? When you have opposition to the war, if all of you kids come in here and you don't agree with what I'm doing or how I'm teaching you, and you protest, am I going to get you taught much? Am I going to be able to teach you anything? So, does that help your war effort to win this war and be done? So the sixth problem is the growing opposition to the Vietnam War in the United States was tremendously hindering our effort to achieve victory in Southeast Asia. It wasn't helping, was it? Heck no, it wasn't. It was a detriment. It was getting to be a bad domino effect in itself. So, if you're President Johnson, and you are feeling the heat from the American public, and people are starting to protest because of these 6 reasons, what might you do to quiet them other than quit? What might you do? Well, man, that's pretty close. What might you do?
Make a video for a
Well, you might try to distract them, or you might make them think that what?
That was a good effort.
Well, that's a good effort that it's getting close to being done. Okay, so it's kind of like me and my kids. So if I wanted to give my kid, my own son, some advice, do you listen to your, I mean, some of you do, but generally, do you listen to your parents all the time? No. You know, if Paul Ramos came and told you that it would be a good idea to do this, or maybe Lee Kennedy, you know, just somebody else, and they told you, give you advice, you might be more apt to listen to that than you might your parent. Everybody's different, but I know teenage kids. So if Johnson tries to assure them that everything's going well, what are they going to do? You're full of crap. You know what I mean? So you got to bring somebody in. You got to bring somebody in that they might believe. And the man that Johnson brought in was this fellow right up here, General William Westmoreland, who was overall commander of American troops in Vietnam. William Westmoreland. So to curb this opposition, Johnson brings in General William Westmoreland. He's the overall commander of American forces in Vietnam, and he calls Saigon, the capital, and he says, I need Westmoreland back in the United States. So Westmoreland gets on a military plane and comes back. And he meets with General Westmoreland. He says, hey, Bill, I don't know if he called him that, how we doing over there? How we doing? I mean, really, we're starting to get a little heat over here. What's going on over there? Give me a, a direct shot here. And when they met, General Westmoreland assured President Johnson that things were going well in Vietnam. So what did Johnson ask Westmoreland to do? That's right, reassure the American people that things were going well. So after Johnson meets with Westmoreland, and Westmoreland says to President Johnson, hey, Mr. President, things aren't going that bad in Vietnam. Actually, they're doing a pretty good job over there. Johnson then says, well, hey, I want you to get on national television and tell the people of America that we're doing okay so we can get some of this stuff curbed. So, as a result of that, on November 21st of 1967, Westmoreland makes a public statement about the military progress in Vietnam to the American people. So Westmoreland agrees to do what the President asked him to do, and on November 21st of 1967, General William Westmoreland makes a public statement about the military progress in Vietnam. And this is what he says, and you don't have to write it down, but I'd like you to listen to it. If you don't get it, you can listen to it on the video. But this is what he told the American people. He said, quote, "I am absolutely certain that whereas in 1965 the enemy was winning, today he is certainly losing. There are indications that the Viet Cong and even Hanoi know this. We have reached an important point when the end begins to come into view." So what's he told the American people, Elise? Yeah, we were getting our butts kicked in 65, I admit it, but now we're winning, and even the Viet Cong know it, and even the government of Hanoi knows that we're winning, and this is a time when the end begins to come into view. So Westmoreland Statement is supposed to reassure Americans that the war in Vietnam is being won, and it's going to be over pretty soon, and actually people bought it. And for the first time during the war since the protests started, Americans became more optimistic, and the protesting quieted some. Okay? So Westmoreland's Statement assured Americans that the war in Vietnam was being won, it would be over soon, and as a result, people in the United States actually did become more optimistic, and the protest quieted for a period of time. However, 10 weeks later, this optimism among Americans would end forever. 10 weeks later, this optimism by Americans, positive outlook about the war, would end forever. It would never recover, would never go back to anyone feeling like they did at that time. And that event that happened 10 weeks later that ruined American optimism towards Vietnam forever was known as the Tet Offensive. Anybody heard of that? Tet Offensive. And I believe, if I'm looking at my notes correctly, that is the next subtopic. We'll get a start on this. The Tet Offensive. This changed the course of American history, in my opinion, on people's support of war. And I think ever since this Tet Offensive, which I'm going to tell you about, people have questioned us in that, from that point on. Now, this Tet Offensive occurred on January 31st, 1968, which was Vietnam's New Year's Day. Did you know that Vietnam's New Year's Day is the last day of the year, of the month of January? So on January 31st, 1968, which is considered the first day of the Vietnamese New Year. You know what they call the first day of the Vietnamese New Year? What? Say it, girl. They call it Tet. That's why we call this the Tet Offensive, okay? We refer to it as New Year's Day. They call their first day of the New Year Tet. And it starts on January 31st of each year. And what happened on January 31st, 1968, the first day of the Vietnamese New Year, or Tet, the North Vietnamese guerrillas launched a massive attack throughout South Vietnam. They being the Viet Cong guerrillas, launched a massive attack throughout South Vietnam. They targeted civilians, they targeted military targets throughout South Vietnam. They targeted civilians, they targeted military targets, they targeted American GIs, South Vietnamese GIs, civilians, everybody. And a massive attack on January 31st, 1968. Why is that a problem? Why were we taken so surprised by that?
We were expecting to be celebrating.
It's a holiday. You don't fight during holidays. That's a war rule. You don't fight during holidays. Everybody was totally off their guard from the American and South Vietnamese perspective. The American and South Vietnamese forces were very unprepared. This was a surprise assault on a war holiday. And you're not supposed to fight on a war holiday. These guys didn't care, obviously, right? So within a 24-hour period of time, more than 84,000 Viet Cong soldiers stormed 3 different strategic areas in South Vietnam without warning on a war holiday. 84,000 Viet Cong soldiers attacked these 3 strategic areas in South Vietnam without warning on a war holiday. 40 different South Vietnamese cities and towns were assaulted. 40 South Vietnamese cities and towns were assaulted by the Viet Cong. 40. 40 South Vietnamese cities and towns. 12 United States military bases were attacked. 12 United States military bases. And the third thing was almost sacrilegious. What do you not ever attack any time?
Church.
No, an embassy. The United States Embassy in Saigon was attacked. That is the no-no of the century. Now, I don't know if you noticed this when we were in Georgetown, but the Ukrainian embassy was like 1/2 a block down from there. You cannot attack an embassy. That is, you don't do that. They are protected by international law. But these people didn't care. They attacked the U.S. Embassy as well. Well, within the first 48 hours of fighting, once that 24 hours came about and we responded, in the next 48 hours, 232 American soldiers were killed, 900 wounded after this assault on the war holiday. So in the first 48 hours of fighting, that would be after the initial 24 hours of assault, during this Tet Offensive, 232 American soldiers were killed and 900 were wounded. Guess who saw this? Live. Everybody in the United States on what? Television. They saw it live. Because these were the days now where you interrupted broadcasts and showed these kind of things. So this wasn't a surprise. These people who had all this great optimism about Vietnam and it was about over, watched the Tet Offensive live and broadcast back to the United States on national television on the nightly news. Now, the most notable military base that was seized during the Tet Offensive was that one at Khe Sanh. Khe Sanh. That was the most notable and most talked about military base of the 12 that were hit, was the military base at Khe Sanh. You know how long the battle for Khe Sanh lasted after the original 24 hours? 77 days. Longest battle of the Vietnam War was at Khe Sanh. And it resulted in the Tet Offensive attack. So the most notable military base under siege during the Tet Offensive was Khe Sanh, and the battle for Khe Sanh lasted 77 days, the longest battle in the entire Vietnam War. It wasn't until April 8th of 1968 that Khe Sanh was secured by American forces. April 8th, 1968, Khe Sanh was secured by American forces. We're talking about Khe Sanh alone. There were 6,000 Americans stationed at Khe Sanh prior to this attack, and during the 77-day battle, 274 were killed and 2,500 wounded. That didn't include the original 200 and some I told you that were killed in the initial attack on Tet, right? So just for the Battle of Khe Sanh, of the 6,000 Americans stationed at Khe Sanh, 274 soldiers were killed and approximately 2,500 were wounded. Of the 20,000 North Vietnamese soldiers that were fighting the Americans at Khe Sanh, the 20,000, over half were killed during the siege of Khe Sanh. So the North Vietnamese lost half of their 20,000. Considerably more than we lost. How many did we lose? 274. How many did they lose? Over 10,000. And I'll make a point on that when we get towards the end of this whole thing. Now, how many North Vietnamese forces were involved in this fighting from the Tet Offensive on? 84,000, right? By the time this thing ended, The North Vietnamese had lost 69% of those 84,000. 69%.
69.
Yeah, 69% of 84,000 were killed. What's that tell you about the North Vietnamese a little bit? They were committed. Loss of life was not an issue. When I get to the end of this and I tell you about, we've all seen the 58,000 names on the Vietnam Wall. If they had a Vietnam Wall for the North Vietnamese soldiers killed in this war, I'll just wait and let you picture it when I tell you how many. They had no regard for loss of life. You think there was protests going on in North Vietnam? You think there were people going crazy? They had no clue. They didn't care. We'll talk about that later. Now, tomorrow, we are going to start the day with the video on the Tet Offensive. Now, how many are not going to be here tomorrow? Okay, not too many. We're going to show this. I'm going to show you the Tet Offensive. I'm going to show you how bad it was. I'm going to show you a case on and show you what kind of fighting went on. That's the plan for tomorrow. Then Monday, we will not see you Monday. And Tuesday, we will continue on. Because you know who's going to start to question the war for the first time? Who would, what?
We have school Monday.
Not him. Yep.
It's lost.
You guys, yeah. Walter Cronkite. Walter Cronkite, the greatest news reporter of all time, is going to go, what is going on here? And that's going to make a huge difference and cause problems for Lyndon Johnson. Okay, we'll continue on. Video tomorrow. You'll need to bring your notebooks. But we'll watch a video tomorrow on the Tet Offensive. Boom.